Right. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Ground and Grow podcast. I am your host, Kayla Estenson Williams, and today we have a special guest who is coming back on the podcast, Madisen Schillo, who is a therapist with me at Minnesota Attachment Collective. She's been on the podcast before talking about life transitions. So if you haven't heard that episode, that's a good one. But yeah, Maddie, I will let you introduce yourself. Just talk a little bit about your specialty, who you work with, and then we'll get into our episode today.
Yeah, so I am obviously one of the clinicians that works at Minnesota Attachment Collective. I kind of see a wide range of clientele. My niche is a little bit of, like adolescents, young adults. Last time we talked about life transitions, which can kind of be a variety of different things.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, I have a holistic person-centered approach. So really tailoring those interventions to like the uniqueness of each client that I see. Um, so yeah, a majority of the things that I work with is like a lot of self-esteem stuff, some eating disorders, um, trauma. I have background in DBT, and so I bring those into session, those like interventions into session. Um, but yeah, that's a little bit about me.
Yeah, Maddie is truly amazing. So if you are in Minnesota and any of the things that she listed there are like things that you want to work on, of course, I know I'm biased, but I highly recommend her. She's an amazing clinician and supports her clients in such incredible ways. So today we are going to talk about a topic that is so important and a topic that also is not talked about a lot because it feels kind of taboo or too intense, right? I think a lot of times people avoid this topic. And Maddie and I were talking in a recent supervision just about how it's been showing up a little bit more. And she was like, maybe this would be a good podcast episode. So today we are going to talk about supporting those who are affected by suicide, whether they are kind of experiencing their own suicidal ideation, but also maybe more specifically, folks who are supporting their own loved ones who are experiencing some suicidal ideation or maybe have died by suicide, right? Which can be a really complicated grief process. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Some obvious trigger warnings, right? We're going to be talking a lot about suicide. We're going to try not to um, make it super triggering or anything like that. But if this is a really sensitive topic, this might be an episode to skip, but it also can be an important one, talking about things that really aren't talked about too much. And so maybe we'll start a little bit with your story, Maddie. I know that you lost a friend, a loved one to suicide years ago. So yeah, maybe if whatever you feel comfortable, just sharing a little bit about your experience, what that was like for you, kind of your grief process a little, just to kind of normalize what that's like for listeners. Yeah.
Yeah, so I do have personal experience with
Mhm.
this topic, and it's actually something that um, I wasn't fully working like as a clinical trainee. I was still kind of like in my internship when it happened, and it was my first experience with a little bit of like countertransference as a therapist. And
Mhm.
so um yeah, it was difficult. I had went through the grieving process of losing a loved one that was not by suicide previously. And I think the thing that sticks out the most within this topic or subject area is, one, we know the grieving process is different for everyone, no matter who they lost, how they died, any of that type of thing. But when it's there's so much more kind of on top of that already, just like grieving the loved one when it is something like suicide, because it is, like you said, something that's kind of taboo. People don't talk about it a lot, but like there are a whole bunch of different emotions that kind of come into it. Um, and some of those emotions that you feel can make you feel like guilty or shameful for
Mm,
even feeling them, but it's still important to be authentic, right? And be like, why is this coming up for me? And it's also okay that I'm feeling this way. So the biggest thing that helped me get through that was like validating, like it's okay to feel this way.
I love that, right? Like allowing for that, because I'm sure, right, like the grief process for anyone is filled with so many complicated emotions, but losing someone in a way that feels so tragic and like just this extra layer of pain can only bring even more complicated emotions, right? And so I love that notion of we can allow for and just honor all of the different emotions that are showing up, which might feel a little conflicting, right? And I think that's hard for us humans to hold space for emotions that maybe don't all make sense together.
Yeah. Well, and it brings up that really good like intricate balance of dialectics that we've talked about before, but like that's the biggest thing with DBT is like you can grieve and be sad and miss the person, and you can also feel frustrated and upset that it happened that way, because it is such a hard thing to go through and to conceptualize when you can never truly know or step into the life of that other person and know what was going on at that time.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I can imagine, and maybe you can speak a little to that too, right? Like when losing a friend, a loved one, a family member to suicide, um, feeling maybe some sense of guilt or responsibility of like, what could I have done differently, or all of those pieces. And right, just as you're saying, knowing that I can never be in their mind. I don't know exactly what they were going through. Can you speak a little bit more to that? Um, I don't know, maybe complex, like just like guilt or responsibility process, and maybe a bit on how you worked through that and maybe challenged that.
Yeah, I think that was the thing that was the hardest is
Hmm.
feeling that guilt. And I know working with clients that have also went through this, that's something that, and like I said, it's unique to everybody, but it is kind of a common theme that you see is like, what could I have done? How could I have stopped this? Taking the responsibility of that person's actions onto yourself and onto your shoulders. In hindsight's 2020, right? Like we can look back
Totally.
on it and we can be like, oh, okay, maybe I would have done this differently. But moving towards that acceptance piece of like, is that more harmful or helpful for me? If I
Mm.
continue to beat myself up for something that I didn't do, that I don't know, I can never truly know if that would have made a difference.
Right.
Holding on to that guilt and resentment towards yourself on something that you can't control and you can't change is usually more harmful than it is
Hmm.
helpful. It keeps us stuck in that stage of grief. And what for me came along with that was a lot of anger, a lot of frustration at myself, but also, at my friend. And that was
Yeah.
hard to
Hmm.
and to even like realize because you don't want to because like you I loved that person and it hurt me to feel that way, but also it's important to honor that as well.
Absolutely. Right. And I'm sure, right, anyone listening who can relate to your story, that probably hits of like, oof, like that anger that you might feel towards that person, right? Even though, of course, holding so much empathy and compassion and just sadness about it. But then, right, I think a part of grief is like, I miss this person and I feel angry that they're not in my life anymore, right? And um, it makes sense, right? That anger would be showing up in so many different directions.
Mm,
Absolutely. And just allowing for it, right? Like all emotions are valid, right? Sometimes the thought process behind it or the actions we want to do with it aren't the most skillful, but Yeah, every emotion makes sense. Even if what we do with it doesn't feel helpful all the time, right? Like anger at yourself, right, is not going to be helpful, right?
Mhm.
But saying, "Oh, hey, there's anger here. It's going in a lot of different directions. What outlets do I need for that?" Right?
Right, and I think to kind of add on to what kind of got me through it or
Yeah.
what was helpful, I was lucky enough to have an amazing support system
Awesome.
around like, I have one of the most authentic and genuine group of friends, I think
Yeah.
that I may be biased, but ever.
Yes,
And
awesome.
so I think with other aspects of grief that I've went through and this one, the thing that kind of made it similar is like anger showed up in both.
Mhm.
And also, what got me through both of them was reaching out and discussing it or just like, you know, word vomiting to people that like
Mhm.
I knew understood.
Yeah.
And there's an aspect of knowing that somebody can understand the situation that you're in and like the feelings that are around it and also like validate
Right.
that and being like, "Oh yeah, I feel that too."
Yes, which it helps you feel less alone, right? And sometimes when we're experiencing complicated anger or guilt or shame, right? Like what those emotions tend to make us do is want to like recoil and withdraw and not share. And so it sounds like one skill that was so important for you was reaching out and allowing people in, right?
Mhm.
And it helped that you had this wonderful support system of friends who got it, right? Who were going through some similar experiences. So you could have that shared experience and get that support there. But yeah, I think for anyone, it's like even if you don't have other loved ones who are in it with you, like sharing that, allowing people to know what you're experiencing and to ask for the support that you need, even when
Yeah,
it's really hard to do.
yeah. And I think something that was helpful too outside of that support group that I knew was experiencing the same
Yeah.
things that I was experiencing, but when talking with people in my support group that I knew hadn't went through the grief
Mhm.
process, like I knew that they hadn't experienced the same thing or went through that, and just stating beforehand that what I needed from them, right? Like I'm not looking for advice.
Mhm.
I'm not looking for toxic positivity. Like positivity is great, but I am
But
of
when
the
it gets to this
it,
toxic place,
yes.
mhm.
Like that's not what I'm looking for. I'm truly just I just want to share what I'm feeling to get that energy out of my body.
Yeah. Wonderful. And that's such a great point, right? And um, I think is like this really important reminder for anyone going through this is like there are going to be people who get it, right? And I think whenever you're in an experience that a lot of other people haven't gone through, like this is I think something that I share with clients all the time, right? It's like there's going to be people who get it, right? And they're going to know kind of a little bit more about what support you need because they've been through a similar thing.
Mhm.
And then there might be other people who are so well-meaning and want to be so supportive, but they might not know how, right? Like if they've never experienced this or known someone who struggled with suicide, like they might feel really uncomfortable with the pain of that. And even though it's not helpful at all, their gut instinct might be to like try to find a silver lining or make it super, super positive for you or find some great meaning for it instead of just being with you in that. So I think I love that you pointed out like for those who might not understand what it's like, it was important for me to share exactly what I needed from them and what I was looking for.
Right. Because otherwise it's just, you ruminate about it and you keep
Hmm.
it inside, you put it in your emotional baggage backpack and you put
Yep.
some boulders in there and like although it's not at the forefront, like you still feel the heaviness of it. And even by just sharing your story with whoever it is, whether it be a
Hmm.
therapist, a loved one, a parent, a partner,
Yep.
that aspect of just talking about it and just sharing it, you do lighten the load.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, like lighten the load, right? Because there's still going to be a heavy load there, right? And you don't have to carry it all by yourself,
Right.
right? And it lightens over time, but it's going to be heavy at first, right?
Mhm.
Um, and so since you've been through this, and I'm sure you have a lot of information on like what support was helpful and what support was not helpful, maybe let's get into that a little bit because there might be people who are listening who, haven't personally lost a loved one to suicide, but maybe they know someone who has, and they're like, I want to be helpful and I want to be supportive, but I don't know what that's like and I don't know how to support them. So maybe let's start with what was helpful, right? Like the things on the like do list, right? Like what are some things that you found really helpful that you would recommend, like if others are in the situation of like, ooh, how do I support someone who lost a loved one to suicide? What are some things that are really helpful?
I think just being like an open and safe place for them,
Hmm.
and also letting them know like whatever you say and whatever you're feeling, I'm not gonna have any judgment towards it. Because I think what makes losing someone to suicide so heavy is that anger piece of it. And I think the one thing that is, or could be potentially the least helpful, is sometimes the response that I had gotten was kind of blaming the person, the loved one that
Mm-hmm.
I lost. And it's like, although part of me was angry for what happened, that wasn't helpful.
Absolutely. Right. Like, and so what you needed is like kind of what you were saying before of like, it's important for people to like, to not, be judgmental about what I was feeling and allow for those feelings, right? So it's like on one hand, yeah, I want them to allow and validate the fact that I might be angry about the situation or feel some amount of anger towards my friend, but also not be in that blaming position towards your
Hmm.
friend, right? Because then that takes it away from your experience and what you need, right? Because
Right.
that's you're not wanting to fuel that anger towards your friend in like an intense way.
Yeah. And I think it's the most, so like, and as therapists, we
Yeah.
are trained and really good at like recognizing what our internal biases are and
Hmm.
not bringing them into session because that may not be, true for the client.
Hmm.
And so being careful, like towing that line of making sure that as I'm supporting somebody that has lost someone to suicide, whatever like internal judgments or biases that I have around suicide in general, I'm not going to bring into that conversation.
Hmm.
Conversation isn't about me. It's not to comfort me in
Right.
the aspect of suicide. It's to comfort my friend or my client or whatever. And so kind of, and you can truly ask, right? Like, how can I support you in this?
Absolutely. I love that. And I think you named a piece that's probably really tricky for anyone supporting someone who's lost a loved one to suicide, right? Is like it probably triggers up their own stuff because again, it's a painful and uncomfortable topic and one that is like so not talked about and like kind of normalized as like this so related to mental health, right? And so I think a lot of people don't understand it, right? If they haven't experienced deep depression, they might have no idea why someone might resort to any kind of suicidal ideation. So they might have their own biases, their own defenses, their own stuff showing up. And so maybe more of a piece of like, oh, that's my work to do. And that is not something that I need to put on my friend who's needing my support, right?
Mhm.
Because I'm sure the last thing that you want to do as you are grieving the loss of your friend is educate someone else on suicide, right? And challenge their, maybe not so helpful perspectives on it.
Right. And I think along the lines of that, just, talking about bringing in our own kind of beliefs and biases,
Yeah.
I will say that usually the first thing that I do when working with clients that have like experienced this, or maybe they have suicidal ideation, the first thing within my practice that I try to do is gauge,
Hmm.
like, okay, this brings up the topic of, like, what are your affiliations with the afterlife or death or
Yeah.
those types of things, so that, like, I have the understanding of what their beliefs are.
I love
And
that.
that's really, really important because
Totally.
we live in a world where there are lots of different forms of religion and
Yeah.
spirituality, so unique, and everybody they have different levels that they, you know,
Hmm.
practice in. And since it is a topic that has to do with death and our belief systems, I think it's important to find that out and to gauge that for the client or person.
Totally. Yes, exactly. And that's so important, and probably something that people don't aren't often like thinking about in those moments, right? Like they might just be thinking of their own belief system or their own faith or spirituality, and maybe trying to put out this comforting response or whatever based on their own belief system around suicide and loss and all of that. And if that is not the same perspective of the person that you are trying to support, that's probably going to feel really invalidating, right? Like that might feel really disconnected. And so allowing, because I think sometimes we feel this expectation to know what to say,
Yeah.
when really it's okay to not know what to say. And it's okay instead to say, hey, like, tell me, like, yeah, what are your thoughts on the afterlife, right? Like, how do you like view this person now and where they're at, right? Like, that I'm sure that question alone is going to actually feel so validating for someone, because then they get to talk about, oh, this is what I'm holding on to, right? And this is what feels comforting for me. And then you get to reinforce that and validate it for them.
Well, and sometimes you kind of run into the situation where, like, they haven't even asked themselves that, right? Because,
Yeah.
like, they're dealing with everything going on right now.
Mm-hmm.
And also, too, that situation can sometimes cause them to not really know and to question it and to just normalize that. Like, it makes sense
Totally.
that, you're struggling right now, and like, we place blame. Sometimes we place blame in other areas, and
Mm-hmm.
it's okay to feel that and to be
Yes.
confused and not really know.
Right. And yeah, it's like not only are you struggling with this really complicated grief, but someone might also be struggling with, you know, a huge question mark related to their faith and spirituality that they maybe haven't faced before. So being able to talk about that feels important,
Mhm.
right? Yeah. So it sounds like on the whole of it, your like number one recommendation for supporting someone going through the loss of a loved one is ask them questions,
Yeah.
allow for their experience, right? Like sit with them in it. And I think
Mm.
as therapists, that's a hat we put on all the time, and it feels so second nature to us of like, oh yeah, we're going to sit with you in this, right? But if you haven't been trained to be a therapist and gone to your master's program and all that stuff, that might be a practice that you're kind of unfamiliar with.
Yeah.
And so it's okay if you don't know how to support someone. And in fact, that is like naming that you don't know exactly what to say or how to do it is going to be more helpful than trying to think of the right thing to say.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And another thing, kind of a little bit going back towards, like, how can somebody support another person, or like what
Yeah.
needs to work. If, as human beings that are empaths,
Yeah.
sensitive, are
Mm-hmm.
for a lot of people is like, I need to fix this.
Yes.
And realistically, you can't fix it.
Mm-hmm.
Can't fix it for that person. You're gonna
Right.
want to take the pain away because it's heavy and it's severe and it's hard to watch somebody that you love and care about go through something
Mm-hmm.
like that. But there's no fix to it.
Right. Yes. Like there's nothing that you can do or say in that moment that's going to make it feel better, right? And in fact, the best thing that you can do is allow for it, right? Like grief, no matter where the grief is coming from, it's a long process, and it's not this process of like, oh, I practice this coping skill and I reduce the grief, right? And I feel better, right? It's like, oh, I practice this coping skill so I can sit with it and like allow myself to go through it and ride these waves. And eventually these waves are not going to be as big and turbulent, but right now they are,
Mhm.
right? And so, yeah, knowing that this person you're supporting is going through these really tough waves, and all you can kind of do is join them in it.
Right. And
Yeah.
you can even name it too, right? Like,
Yeah.
I really wish that I could take your pain away, and I can't.
Hmm. Hmm.
So I'm gonna sit with you in it, and we're gonna share it together, so you're not
Yeah. Oh, right. And like just as you're saying it, I'm like imagining like that would feel so powerful, right? Like that would feel so huge.
alone.
Absolutely. Yeah. So great tips on that. I feel like people are going to be equipped with like, okay, it's okay that I don't know what to do, and here's where I can start.
Mhm.
Um, Now I would love to know, like, I mean, from your own personal experience with your friend, but also as a therapist, right? Like, when, let's say, someone has a friend or loved one struggling with suicidal ideation, right? Maybe they're going through some tough mental health stuff, and they're struggling with, hey, do I want to keep living or not?
Mhm.
Um, what are some things that a loved one can do to support them? And also, like, at what point and how might you recommend they, kind of support that person in getting professional support? Because I think it's important to talk about, like, you can't fix it, and you can't, like, you are not a professional in this. And it's okay to, like, not know exactly how to support someone in that.
Mhm.
And I'll put crisis resources in the notes for folks here, like all of that. But yeah, what are just some things that someone who has a loved one going through any kind of suicidal ideation, like what can they do to support them?
I think one of one of the things that I have found helpful after kind of assessing like
Hmm.
beliefs, afterlife, all of that stuff, a lot of the times, when suicidal ideation comes up for somebody, they don't feel their own self-worth, right? Like,
Hmm.
and some, you know, comments that they may say is like, I don't like, what is life worth living? Or
Hmm.
I don't know what the purpose of all of this is. Or, you know, it wouldn't be like different if I wasn't here anymore. And so something that I always strongly encourage is like, let that person know how they show up in your life, how they're
Hmm.
contributing to your life, what you appreciate about them. Like, point out those things of like, you're a great friend and you have all of these positive attributes, and see how they take that in, because I think, we've talked about it before, we're our own worst critics, and
Absolutely.
that negative voice in the back of our head is there to just ruin our day. And so it's hard for us to see the positive aspects of ourselves that contribute to other people's well-being. And so if we're not finding that sense of purpose in our own life, can we take that and find kind of like the protective factors or the life worth living and how we show up in other people's lives?
Like kind of helping them to check the facts a little bit, right? Because in some of these moments, right, and especially when someone is in this place where they're thinking about suicide, right, like from a therapist perspective, like we know they're in this like tough emotion mind place, which means we're not we're not the best perspective takers, right? Like in that we are kind of consumed by some really intense thoughts, and they're not facts, right? They are these critical self statements um, that might actually be very different than how someone else sees us, right? So it sounds like when you can see your loved one like kind of in that spiral for themselves, like helping them to like, let's take a moment, let's take a step back. Like this is how I view you, right? And that doesn't align with what your mind is telling you right now.
Or even asking the question if are sitting with somebody, like something that I've done in session before is, okay, tell me how your sister, your mom, whoever, how would they describe you?
Hmm.
And that then makes them think of like, you know, the one person or a few people in their lives that they know that they're close to and that love them, right? Like I know realistically, like my mom is usually never going to say anything bad about me. And so if
Yeah.
I'm like, how would my mom describe me? I know it's going to be positive.
I love that. Yeah. Yes. And so, yeah, to kind of help people identify like who are your safe people or who's your safe person and like what would they say, right? And it might be their mom or it might be their friend or it might be their partner or it might be their dog, right? Like your
Yes.
dog is obsessed with you, right? Like what does your dog think about you?
Right.
And so I think that helping them kind of challenge some of those things can be a useful tool and letting them know that like you're an important person in my life,
Yeah.
right? It's
Yeah.
huge because I'm sure their mind is telling them that they're not important to anybody, right?
Right. hmm
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I think the part that's hard, like the second piece of that question is like,
Hmm.
okay, where do we go from here? How do we know when it's getting to that point where like crisis resources are needed?
Yep.
And that is something that is so hard to balance
Yeah.
because it can be reinforced in different ways. And it's hard to know what's going to be helpful or harmful.
Right.
Because so in the area that I'm in, the number one crisis center is Genrose.
Hmm.
And that can either be something that like they really need, right? They need that like extra support and care and the crisis therapy that they have there. Um, and it can be really life changing, but it can also for somebody else, like that can be really scary and feel like,
Yeah.
their control is taken away or their autonomy is taken away. So it's hard to know. It's hard to balance that.
Absolutely. And it can be hard to know, like, at what, especially if you are not a trained professional in this moment, right? It can be hard to know, like, okay, are we at the point where we need to do any kind of intervention possible to keep you alive, or can we start at a lower intensity, right? And I think with that, and what we as therapists do in the room, is like, if it's at a point where you really feel like they are going to act on suicide, right? It's like, okay, we're we're calling to get a welfare check or calling crisis resources immediately. But I think naming this piece of like there can be a lot of trauma in that, right? And I know sometimes like the best thing that you can do if it's true crisis moment is like I need to call the police and have someone come in and make sure we don't get to that point, but like we can also name that can be really complicated
Yeah.
depending on um, the area that you live in and who's responding, right? Like
Mm,
I know some places um, around me in the Twin Cities, right? Like there are some crisis resources that are not police that can be a little bit easier to connect to, but that's not available in every area. And sometimes your only option might be calling the police. And so it's like, if you need to, you need to, but
right.
also recognizing, ooh, this could be really traumatic, or there can be safety concerns around that, right? Depending on their own background and everything.
Yeah.
But it's like, yeah, sometimes you need to resort to that, or you need to call to get an ambulance to get someone into the hospital. And so what about like in the moments when you're like, okay, my friend is maybe seeming to struggle with like some of these more like what we in the therapy world call like more passive suicidal ideation, right? Where someone's like feeling like, oh, like I just don't want to be here anymore, but they don't have a plan. They're saying, I'm not going to act on it. I would never do that, but I'm
Right.
feeling so depressed, right?
Right.
Um, what things might what ways might softly or sometimes even more strongly encourage them just getting an outpatient therapist, right? Like starting with like, let's get you into someone's office so they can do a better assessment and support you through navigating what you're going through.
I think just naming, how it feels for you to hear that, right? Like I'm really, sad that you're having those feelings, and I'm also not equipped with, like, I would love to help you process it and
Hmm.
get deeper into that, but I feel like I can't do that. I don't have those types of resources that other people do. And just asking them, like, how do you feel about going to a professional for this? Have you went to one before? What was your experience like? I think really asking those questions, and even asking, like, when did you start feeling this way? Like, just basic open-ended questions to help them start to process, like, when did this
Hmm.
start? Are there underlying things or things that are tied into it? And yeah, of course, always addressing like safety concerns and, do we have means and access and all of those things. But like letting them know that like that's a really scary thought. And we I would love for you to get help. Would you like to process that with me, and like, how that process works?
Yes. And that's a nice point there, right? Like if someone hasn't ever accessed mental health resources before, maybe they have and they've had a negative experience before, like there could be complicated reasons why the thought of going to a therapist's office might feel really uncomfortable and not feel like the place that they want to go. So allowing for that to be a conversation of like, okay, like I feel like the support would be helpful. Like, what's showing up there to help them process that and maybe get to a point where it's like, okay, what would help me access that resource,
Yeah,
right? And I also loved how you named like a good boundary there, which I think is so important because if someone you care about is going through some tough suicidal ideation, um, you might feel especially if you're like maybe the only person they've told, you might feel this responsibility of like, oh, I have to help them through this, right? And I have to figure out if they're going to be safe. I have to make sure they're okay. And that is too much responsibility, right? Like you, it's a hard thing to say, but you can't, right? Like
yeah,
you can't keep someone alive. You can support them and help them access resources and give them love, but you can't keep them alive. Even professionals, right? We
right,
can't keep people alive. We're trained to do assessments and know what to do, but even that isn't isn't always going to be enough. And so I think that's important for folks listening of like, okay, at what point am I feeling in over my head, right? If it's
mm,
just a really like a passing thought, but I can tell they feel confident in how they're going to navigate it, like we might be okay. I might still encourage, seeing a professional. But if it's at a point where I'm like, ooh, I'm feeling really afraid and I'm worried about my friend, know that it's not your responsibility to keep them alive, and it's okay to like put out this boundary of, hey, I want to support you and I want to help you through this, and like, I'm not equipped to do that, right? Like, I don't know how to do that. This is more, I'm not a trained therapist, right? Like, this isn't that role that I feel confident in. And, you know, even being able to say, like, I would love for you to see a professional and I want to support you in doing that and having that conversation about what shows up for them. But it might even be, right? Maybe they're open to it, but they're like, I don't even know where to begin because
mm,
finding a therapist that's a good fit for you is really hard, right? Like even for us therapists that know how to do it, like it can be hard.
yeah,
And so, sometimes, when I've had people in my life being like, okay, I want to see a therapist, but I don't know what to do, right? Like you can be that friend that's like, okay, let's look things up right now, right? And I'll put some like directory listings in the show notes too. So if you're like, I don't know where to start, like I'll put some areas where you can look up therapists, look up specialties and all of that. But if they're really struggling with that depression, like that action step of finding that therapist,
yeah,
calling to book that appointment might feel really hard. So maybe the way that you support is like, okay, let's help you get a therapist. We're going to look at people right now. I'll send the email for you. We'll
Right.
get you on their schedule, right? That can be this piece of like, I'm going to help you navigate this support.
Mhm.
Absolutely. Oh, so yeah, it's heavy, right? And it's
Right.
hard and it's full of a lot of different feelings. But yeah, I'm hoping. I know from the things that you shared today, I'm like, ooh, I feel like people listening in are gonna have so many more tools to connect to that can be helpful. But are there any like other things that you'd like to add, either in helping a loved one who's lost someone to suicide, or um, for folks who are navigating their own struggles with suicidal ideation? Like any final like last thoughts that you want to share with everybody?
The thing that comes to mind a little bit with what we were talking about is just how, and it's different for everybody, but a lot of the times, depression and the suicidal ideation thrives in isolation.
Mm-hmm.
And so,
Mm-hmm.
with supporting someone that is having suicidal ideation, as well as, helping somebody grieve another person, like just being a human presence is enough. Like,
Yes.
I when I was personally going through it, like I kind of recognized I wanted to isolate. I was like, I don't want to
Yeah.
be around people. It's just too much work. But
Mm-hmm.
there were key people in my life that were like, we can just exist at the same time.
Yes.
Like, on the couch, like let's just
Mm-hmm.
watch movies, or we both sit there and like be on our phones. You don't have to
Yeah.
feel pressured to interact or anything like that, but
Mm-hmm.
just sharing that humanness with another person, letting them know like you are not alone through this, whether you're grieving someone or whether you're experiencing it, you're not alone.
Love that. Yes. And that it doesn't require anyone to have these like this special skill set, right? It's like, okay, I'm coming over. We're gonna sit on the couch, we're gonna scroll social media or whatever, or put on a funny show, and we don't even have to talk.
Yeah.
That's okay. But wonderful. Well, thank you so much for coming in and sharing your story, right? Like sharing some vulnerable experiences. I really appreciate you opening up about that. And I'm sure that's going to just like normalize it for so many other people who feel really isolated in that experience. And thank you for sharing all of your helpful tips, both from your personal and professional perspectives. I think um, I loved hearing all of it, and I'm sure it's going to be really helpful for folks navigating this really tough experience. I will put all the details of how people can connect with you in the show notes, but do you want to just throw a little shout out to yourself of how people can find you, see your content, all of that?
Yeah, so I have an Instagram page called Schillo Wellness. So I post all the therapy things on there. Um, if you're not in the southern Minnesota area, I do telehealth therapy through Minnesota Attachment. Otherwise, I do in person in Rochester at Onward Counseling Rochester, a
Nice.
great group of clinicians there that also have a lot of really awesome subsets as well. So shout out to them.
Yes, absolutely.
Um, so yeah, those are the ways that you can find me.
Nice. Yeah. So yeah, if you're listening and you're like, "Ooh, Maddie sounds amazing," she does have a few openings, but she also is like they're few and far between sometimes, because when people work with her, they want to stick with her. So I'd recommend checking her out if you are looking for some support. And if you don't live in Minnesota, you can follow her Instagram. I will link it in the show notes so you can find it and follow along with her there. Um, but yeah, otherwise, thank you everyone for tuning in. Thanks again, Maddie, for sharing everything. And I hope everyone has a nice rest of their week.
Yeah.